Alright, welcome back to Philosophy 101. We're going to jump right in this week, and we're just going to look at the debate between Socrates and Thrasymachus over the two questions: what is justice, and why care about being just? So let's do it. There we go. Okay, now, who was Thrasymachus? At 336b of the text, we meet the most colorful character who will appear in the Republic. Thrasymachus is introduced with the following words. Now, Thrasymachus had many times started out to take over the argument in the midst of our discussion, but he had been restrained by the men sitting near him, who wanted to hear the argument out. But when we paused, he could no longer keep quiet. Hunched up like a wild beast, he flung himself at us as if to tear us to pieces. Then both Polemarchus and I got all in a flutter from frights. Notice the violence with which Thrasymachus enters the conversation. He is even described as a wild beast. You already know from the opening passages of the Republic, that Plato has linked desire for power with the refusal to listen to reason. He has also linked the desire for pleasures of the senses with tyrannical power. Thrasymachus is an embodiment of the power-hungry, irrational man. He even mocks Socrates because Socrates allows others to speak instead of completely dominating the conversation himself. Thrasymachus, who is a real historical figure, is very much Socrates' opposite. Here are some of the key differences between the two men. First, Socrates saw everyone for free by engaging them in informal conversation. Thrasymachus was paid large sums of money by the ruling elite for his teaching. As a sophist, Thrasymachus' job was to teach young princes to manipulate the masses using deceptive speech. This is why Glaucon often offers to pay him to speak, and why Plato mentions explicitly that Socrates has little money. Second, Socrates' goal was to discover the truth, and he thought of the people he talked with as allies in the search for truth. Thrasymachus thought of conversation as a kind of verbal death match in which the winner takes all. To him, it's the appearance of victory, not the actual quality of argument that matter. Third, Socrates is calm and in control of his emotions, whereas Thrasymachus is highly agitated and often gets impatient during the course of an argument. And finally, Socrates does not think that the rich and powerful are especially wise, whereas Thrasymachus thinks that the rulers more or less create the truth by the use of force. You will understand what I mean by this last point when we discuss his theory of justice. Now let us proceed to the argument they have over the nature of justice. It is important to notice, as we proceed, how the theory of justice which Thrasymachus defends is very much a reflection of his own personal character. Okay. Question 1a. Thrasymachus' theory of justice. After taunting Socrates for a bit, for Socrates' preference to ask questions instead of answering them, Thrasymachus finally agrees to propose a theory of justice himself because Socrates insists that he does not have any idea of what justice is. So this is the famous Socratic ignorance or Socratic humility. Socrates only thinks he's wise because he knows that he doesn't know everything, or sometimes he states that stronger. He says, I'm wise because I know I don't know anything. But he doesn't claim to be wise because he's figured out what all these important concepts mean. Okay. At 338c, Thrasymachus says that justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger. According to Thrasymachus, the rules that everyone accepts as the correct or just rules to live by are the rules that powerful members of society have forced everybody to obey. At 338e, Thrasymachus goes on to say that, and go ahead and read this long quote here. Pause the presentation until you're done reading the quote, and then we'll go on. Okay, so hopefully you've paused, read it, and unpaused, so let's go on. So here's a plausible summary. The basic idea is that Thrasymachus has defined the just rules as whatever rules happen to be enforced in a particular society. The just thing to do is merely what you would get in trouble for failing to do. Or in other words, might makes right. Okay. Now, there's an obvious objection to this. You might have the following initial thought about this claim. We seek justice precisely because of the fact that the way societies are actually run is often unjust. I would say that Thrasymachus is right that the strong can usually get the weak to do what they want them to do, but this is precisely the problem. If a person follows a system that does not take their interest into account for fear of getting into trouble, then the system of laws is unjust. Socrates will shortly argue that the goal of a just society is to benefit its members. So he'll more or less make this objection. But first, let us look at his initial objection to Thrasymachus in the text. This is another good example of his use of counterexample to raise difficulties for definition. So this is another example of just the classic Socratic method itself. Okay. Socrates raises a problem for Thrasymachus' argument by noting that rulers are sometimes wrong about what is in their best interest. Hence, Thrasymachus' claim that justice is what in fact serves the interest of the stronger conflicts with his claim that the just thing for citizens to do is to obey their rulers. For if subjects always obey their rulers, and if that's just to always do so, they will occasionally perform actions that undermine their rulers' interests, again because the rulers have mistakenly suggested a course of action that was against their own self-interests. Polemarchus gives a clear summary of this argument in 340b. Okay. You can also post a question about this to discussion board 1 if it's still a little foggy for you. But if not, let's keep rolling. Okay. Questions 1C and D. Thrasymachus' response. In regard to 1C, I think this is pronounced Cleitophon, he suggests that what Thrasymachus meant was that justice is what the strong think serves their interests. This would, in fact, resolve the contradiction brought up by Socrates. Remember, it was the twin claims. Justice is what is in the interest of the stronger, and the just thing to do, always and forever, is to obey the leader's what the leaders command. Now, if justice simply is whatever serves the interest of the stronger, then if they mistakenly command you to do something that is against their interests, that can't also be just. So Thrasymachus has two criteria of justice going here, and they conflict with one another. That's Socrates' point. Justice can't be both whatever is in the interest of the stronger and whatever the rulers command everybody to do. One of those has to go. Okay. Now, Cleitophon, Cleitophon, I think is how he decided to pronounce this. Okay, so he suggested that what Thrasymachus meant was that justice is what the strong think serves their interest. Now, if that were the case, then there would be no contradiction here, because if the rulers thought, well, it's just if you follow law X, and law X turned out to be against their self-interest, and you went ahead and followed that law, you wouldn't be violating that definition of justice itself, because the definition would no longer be justice is what is actually in the interest of the stronger. It's only what they think it is. It might help, or it might not, I don't know, to pause and kind of write some of this out. So, for example, you could say, here's idea 1, or premise 1. According to Thrasymachus, justice is what is in the interest of the stronger. Premise 2, or idea 2. Thrasymachus also thinks that it's always just to obey what the rulers have commanded. And then the third idea would be, though, if it's always just to obey what they've commanded, then sometimes it's just to perform an action which goes against their self-interest. And again, that conflicts with the first idea we stated. So Cleitophon, he has us change that first idea from justice is what is actually from justice is what benefits the stronger to what they think, to justice is what the strong thinks serves their best interests. And when you have all those ideas written out, I think you'll see that even though Thrasymachus' original definition, justice is what serves the interest of the stronger, conflicts with it's always just to obey the ruler's commands, given that they sometimes make mistakes. Cleitophon's suggestion doesn't have that contradiction. Okay. And again, if there's any confusion on this, just post that question to discussion board 1. I'll try to give some further clarification. Okay. But in any case, Thrasymachus does not wish to adopt Cleitophon's response. He has a weird way of phrasing this. He says, because it makes the conditions of justice depend on a leader's weakness. Now, what he means by that is he doesn't want to define justice as what the strong think serves their interests, precisely because there's sometimes they're wrong about that. So he doesn't want conditions under which they make a mistake to be a part of the definition of justice. Okay. So, what Thrasymachus suggests is that justice is what is actually in the interests of the stronger. So he holds on to his original definition. Justice really is, according to Thrasymachus, what is in the interest of the stronger. So if the rulers give a command that they falsely believe is in their own interests, he's willing to say that that command is actually unjust, even though the rulers commanded it. Okay. And he has a funny way of putting this. He draws a little analogy. He says that doctors are acting as doctors when they properly treat the sick, and that rulers are acting as rulers when they properly command what is in their own best interests. When they're mistaken about that, they're not even really acting as rulers anymore. Maybe they're acting as a person who makes a mistake or something like that. So, in response to Socrates' proposed contradiction, Thrasymachus simply abandons the claim that it's always just to obey one's rulers, and holds on to the claim that that justice is whatever is in the leader's or the ruler's best interest. Okay, moving on. Now, question 2a. The purpose of an art or science is to quote-unquote serve the weaker. In answering question 1, a distinction was drawn between being a ruler and acting as a ruler. To act as a ruler is to act in your ruling capacity. In other words, to pass laws, defend the city-state, and resolve disputes. Acting as a ruler can be thought of as an art or a science. These two terms were very similar in Socrates' days. The art of leading a society is simply the art of political science. Socrates assumes that the arts have a lot in common with each other, and he proceeds to ask about the nature of arts and sciences in general. He wants to know if arts serve themselves or are used to serve the weaker, as he puts it. The art of medicine does not heal medicine itself, it heals the body. Therefore, a doctor uses this art to heal the sick. Similarly, a ship captain uses the art of sea captaining to guide the people on the ship, not to guide the art of sea captaining itself. Political science is used to advise everyone, hence Socrates concludes that it must serve everyone's interests. Hence justice is not the interests of only the strong, it's what is in the interest of everyone, because it's the nature of a science to serve any people engaging in the activity that are relevant to it. Activities which are relevant. Okay. Now, Thrasymachus has a response to this. Um, he thinks that it's a bad argument. He points out that a sheep herder, or a shepherd, raises sheep in order to slaughter them. So even if the art of sheep herding is geared towards getting the sheep to behave in a way which, benefits the sheep in the short run, the ultimate interest of the shepherd is to slaughter those sheep. So the shepherd is actually acting in his or her own best interests. Okay, now, this parallels Thrasymachus' claim that rulers shepherd the people, so to speak, for their own interests and not for the interests of the people. Socrates will respond to this a little later. Okay, now, but first there's a little digression here. Why being unjust is wiser, of course, according to Thrasymachus. In the exceptionally long paragraph, which starts at 343b, a subtle change occurs that is easy to miss in this paragraph. In the course of arguing that shepherds do not care about what is in the best interest of the sheep, Thrasymachus accidentally starts using the term unjust to refer to those who are strong and trample on the rights of others, and just to refer to those who deal fairly with others. At this point in the dialogue, the question under discussion becomes, is it more foolish to be unjust, in other words, trample on others, or just, which roughly means dealing fairly with others? Now, the assumption that Plato makes is that we all know and agree that manipulating others selfishly is what we mean by unjust, and dealing fairly with others is what we mean by just. Even Thrasymachus, who proposes a different definition, cannot help but think of these terms in this way as the dialogue proceeds. Thrasymachus' real claim, then, is that it is foolish to be just. Socrates will note the fact that the question under discussion has shifted around 345b, but he will first attempt to finish discussing Thrasymachus' concept of justice. Basically what happens in the text is Thrasymachus is no longer asking what is justice. He switches to defending the claim that it's better to be unjust than just. And again, his usage of those terms reverts to the common usage, not the usage contained in his own definition of justice. Okay. So moving on. Again, notice that we have shifted our usage of the term justice, as Thrasymachus and Socrates have. Thrasymachus argues that an unjust or unscrupulous person always gets more benefits than the just. That's the new argument. That's the topic switch. The just person is constantly taken advantage of, whereas the unjust person gets to take advantage of others. So when a just and unjust person have a contract, the just person does his or her part, and the unjust runs off with the reward. On a societal scale, the tyrant has the resources to offer funds unlawfully and please powerful allies, whereas the just person will offend powerful people by not offering unlawful gifts. The Thrasymachus says that people censure or object to injustice not because they are really opposed to being unjust themselves, they would love to do that. They do so only because they fear that they will suffer from others' injustice. Hence, Thrasymachus' answer to why most people say that justice is better than injustice is that they fear being trampled on by unjust people, not that they deeply value justice itself. Okay. Now, right, so there's that thought. Question 4a, why people must be paid to take office. Okay, now starting right before 346a, Socrates argues that justice does not mean whatever is in the interest of the stronger. He argues against the view that justice means whatever is in the interest of the stronger by mentioning the fact that people must be paid to take office. His focus is on the lower ranking offices. If a person could take office and merely support their own interests, then we would expect that people would line up for the job even without any pay. However, since what they in fact have to do is serve the interests of others, pay is demanded. Notice that Socrates has not allowed the conversation to jump to a new topic without finishing an argument that has already been started. So in other words, when Socrates responds to Thrasymachus in the text, he doesn't right away address Thrasymachus's claim that it's better to be unjust than just. Socrates, what he does is he carries on their first conversation about what justice is. So the argument he gives here about people being made, having to pay people to take office, that's in response again to Thrasymachus's claim that justice is whatever is in the interest of the stronger. It's not in response to his claim that it's more beneficial to be unjust than just. Now, and again, part of Plato's purpose in writing in dialogue form is to teach his audience how to keep philosophical arguments disciplined and on track in order to prevent wasting time by jumping all over the place. Plato does not really want us to study philosophy. He wants us to become better and more philosophical persons, and this involves mastering various conversational tools, such as keeping on topic. So the next time you're in a debate, either mentally or out loud, try and note when the topic is changed, and also try and note, oh, did we actually finish talking about what we started before we made the shift, or are we just kind of jumping from one topic to another? And again, Plato wants us to develop this skill of kind of staying on track. Okay, now the shepherd argument, the resolution of the shepherd argument. So starting at 345c, Socrates finishes what he wants to say about Thrasymachus's claim that shepherds care for their own interests and not the interests of the sheep, and that therefore it is not the case that all arts or sciences are geared towards serving a group whose activity falls under the science itself. Socrates reminds Thrasymachus that he agrees that there's a difference between a common use of a term and a strict use, and that on a strict use of the term shepherd, the person who is the shepherd acts in her capacity as shepherd by taking care of the sheep. When it comes time to kill the sheep and sell the products, the shepherd is no longer acting in his or her capacity to shepherd. They are actually acting like a moneymaker in those situations. So, again, Socrates said, look, the purpose of all sciences is to serve anyone engaging in an activity relevant to the science. Thrasymachus countered and said, well, not really. The shepherd raises the sheep, not for their own interest, but for his or her own. He or she slaughters those sheep in the end, and that's that. And Socrates is saying here, well, okay, but if we're being strict in our usage of the term shepherd, notice that it is only when the shepherd benefits the sheep that the shepherd is acting like a shepherd. When the shepherd goes on to slaughter the sheep, the shepherd is acting differently, like a moneymaker. Just so you know, this is a horrible argument in a way. Thrasymachus doesn't respond to it, but all he would have had to say is, okay, well, my new counter example is the art of slaughtering. The art of slaughtering does not benefit those being slaughtered. And that would disrupt Socrates' point that all sciences aim to benefit those who are engaging in activities that are relevant to that science. You know, warfare might be another one. The enemy is destroyed by war, not benefited. In any case, this is not perhaps the best argument Socrates ever made, just to put it mildly. Okay. Now, 4c. Why do good persons rule? Now, this is a better argument. If Socrates is going to argue that good people do not rule in order to serve their own interests to the exclusion of the interests of those ruled, he has to propose a plausible account of why a good person would choose to rule. Or I should say that when I say this is a good argument, I guess what I was thinking of, when he made that claim, if a person's in office, they have to get paid, and that wouldn't be the case if they got to do whatever serves their own interest. That's a better argument against Thrasymachus's claim that justice only serves the interests of the strong. But when Socrates says that, when he says, look, people have to take ruling the people does not serve the ruler's best interests. Now he has to answer the question, why rule then? Why would a good person choose to rule? Okay. So here we go. He notes that doing something just for the money or because it will bring honor is generally frowned upon, and concludes that the motive of serving in office just for money or honor can't be why the good person goes about serving in office. He also notes that persons of good character often have to be compelled to take office, as opposed to pursuing that office out of a desire to have power. Socrates says that the good person chooses to rule in order to avoid the penalty of being ruled over by someone who is not as well motivated and competent. Okay, one second. Notice that Socrates does not claim that the just person is completely focused on the good of others and rules out of unselfish loyalty to them. That degree of selflessness is very rare, and it's not necessary in order to qualify oneself as being well motivated. So the good person merely has to want to avoid being ruled over incompetently to go ahead and take the job. It is a good enough motivation that one would not want to be ruled by selfish or unjust or incompetent persons. Hence, the burden of leading for the good person is lighter than the burden of not leading. And that's the real reason such a good person will take office. Socrates then transitions to a discussion of Thrasymachus's claim that it is better to be completely unjust than it is to be completely just. Okay, so remember, Thrasymachus tried to jump topics. Socrates didn't let him. He gave an argument in response to the first topic they were discussing, what justice is, and only now, after finishing that conversation to his satisfaction, having some resolution, now he'll address that second claim, that it's actually better to be more in one's self-interest to be completely unjust than completely just. Okay. All right, so what terms are nearly synonymous with justice? Socrates' overarching goal is to determine if it is good or beneficial to behave in a just manner. So that's the new goal. He states that on his view, to be just is nearly the same as being virtuous, and being unjust is the same as being vice-ridden or vicious. Thrasymachus defines justice as sublime simplicity, which is a kind of naivete, and injustice as discretion, a sort of kind of practical wisdom of getting what you want. And Thrasymachus thinks that having an unjust character is virtuous, which is the opposite of what Socrates thinks. Okay. So now, Thrasymachus, well, actually, I'll just continue. I wanted to make a little point here, but I don't want to overload. Okay, so here we go. So in a nutshell, you can think of virtue as an excellence. And Socrates says that being just is a human excellence, whereas Thrasymachus says that being unjust, in other words, skillfully self-serving, he says that that is the excellence that we should try to maintain. Plato is modeling for us, through the presentation of this dialogue, how to define a term. What you do is figure out what, one thing you can do is figure out what other terms are closely associated with it. Socrates, having defined justice as a virtue, then asks if being just or virtuous is good and wise. In other words, does a person benefit from behaving justly? Which is yet another way of asking, is being just a human virtue or excellence? Because notice it would be really odd to say that being just is a human excellence, it's a human virtue, yet when you act this way, it goes against what is truly good for you. That would be a weird thing to say. Okay. Now, here is probably the most important argument of Book 1, because it really captures how Socrates and Plato kind of thought about justice and injustice. So let's go through it. At 351c, Socrates launches a final argument against Thrasymachus. Basically, it is the nature of the completely unjust person to deceive, control, and outdo everyone else. This means that a group of truly unjust persons will not be able to cooperate enough to effectively defeat a group of just persons that can work together. So this is a kind of playing by Thrasymachus' own rules. On a practical level, is it better to be completely just or completely unjust? Socrates is saying, look, if you put a just group of people who are loyal to each other and cooperate against a group of unjust people who are very likely to, or perhaps if they're maximally unjust, who will betray each other, then the just people will eventually triumph. So, injustice in a way kind of plants the seed of its own destruction. Think of the mafia. The mafia can only effectively overrun others. Let me back up again for a second. Now, Socrates says at one point, in order to effectively behave in a way that is mostly unjust, as opposed to completely unjust, you actually have to employ a good bit of just behavior. So, for example, when one needs to treat their partners in crime with respect, and they must be able to trust one another if they're going to be successful criminals. So think of the mafia. The mafia can only effectively overrun others if they maintain a certain level of cooperation and respect. So remember, the challenge is, let's compare perfect injustice, radical injustice, with perfect justice. And so we're not yet addressing the kind of middle ground where you have a person who, they're unjust enough to be objectionable, but they're just enough to be able to cooperate with others and that sort of thing in order to accomplish their evil deeds. In order to say that that is not a better life to lead than a fundamentally just life, that's actually a more tricky project, and that's what the rest of the book of the entire Republic is in a way dedicated to. But here, there's like a slightly easier challenge on the table. Thrasymachus is saying, look, to be unjust, that's the excellence. To be great at that is to succeed as a human being because you get whatever you want. And Socrates is saying, no, actually, if you're completely unjust, you can't cooperate with anybody, and your efforts will disintegrate, and the just will easily defeat you. So evil or injustice on an extreme level is undone by internal dissension. And a good historical example of this is World War II. If Hitler and Stalin had cooperated instead of turning on each other, it is overwhelmingly probable that they would have won World War II. However, they did not trust each other and were not satisfied sharing power. So Hitler tried to invade Russia, and any good historian will tell you this was his ultimate error. This is what caused him to lose the war. Stalin and Hitler were rolling before that. They just had amassed massive armed forces. But again, nature of evil. There's no no loyalty among thieves kind of thing. Hitler decided that it was intolerable to have to share power with Stalin. He was kind of paranoid. He assumed that Stalin would eventually try to take his power. So in the middle of trying to defeat the Allies, or the Allied forces, us, Britain and France and those folks, he decides to fight his own partner and goes after Stalin, and this eventually leads to his downfall. Okay, so next slide. And the problem isn't only external, that if you're a maximally unjust person, it's not just that you can't get along with anyone else, you also have trouble getting along with yourself. So Socrates goes on to say that the unjust person is not only at war with everyone, but is riddled with internal discord. In other words, the various parts of the unjust person's psyche are at war with one another as strong desires begin to compete with one another. As Socrates says, yet is not the power which injustice exercises of such a nature that wherever she takes up her abode or home, whether in a city, in an army, in a family, or in any other body, that body is to begin with rendered incapable of united action by reason of sedition and distraction. And is not injustice equally fatal when existing in a single person, in the first place rendering him incapable of action because he is not at unity with himself, and in the second place making him an enemy to himself and the just? Is not that true, Thrasymachus? And at this point in the conversation, Thrasymachus kind of acknowledges defeat. And it's interesting. Instead of being this wild beast as he started out, he's this tame, meek man who's just like, okay, Socrates, you're right, Socrates. Thank you, Socrates. And that too is that's something Plato wants us to see. He thinks when a person does engage rationally, that there is a natural calming of the passions. So Plato wants us to see that by engaging in the philosophical dialogue, he's become a little bit more just. He's that internal discord in his own soul has quieted down, at least momentarily, so on and so forth. Okay, now, as I said, this argument about justice unifying the city-state, the family, the individual within his or herself, that captures a lot of what Plato means by justice. Now, there's a much more difficult challenge coming, so this is kind of a cliffhanger. In our next reading, a much more subtle unjust person is described. It's the person who acts in a very self-interested way, but is not so unjust that they can't cooperate with other people in order to get what they want. They're just enough, but in a way that allows them to really accomplish great evil. And the challenge is put to Socrates. What about that person? Why would that person choose to treat others fairly if they're really skilled at treating them unfairly and getting what they want in doing so? So that's next week. All right, so go ahead and look at the discussion boards now. And again, choose one of those questions for your initial post, and be sure to respond twice to other people's posts. All right, thanks.